I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Toronto for theAnalysis-news. Last Thursday, CIA Director John Ratcliffe traveled to Havana, Cuba for talks with Cuban officials at the Interior Ministry. That was May 14th. Then days later, on Wednesday, May 20th, the Trump administration unveiled criminal charges against former Cuban President Raúl Castro, now 94 years old, over the 1996 downing of two aircrafts operated by Brothers to the Rescue, a Miami-based anti-Castro exile organization. 4 men were killed in the incident. That was 30 years ago. For decades, the story has largely been covered through the lens of Miami exile community and U.S. national security interests. Now, Cuba's position is rarely given equal attention in the U.S. Havana has long maintained that the aircraft repeatedly violated Cuban airspace. Despite repeated warnings from the Cuban military authorities, the aircraft were conducting surveillance operations and anti-government leaflet drops over the island during a period of heightened tensions and ongoing U.S.-backed efforts to destabilize the Cuban government. From Cuba's perspective, the flights represent a direct challenge to its sovereignty, territorial integrity, not to mention their airspace. The indictment against former President Raúl Castro now signals a significant escalation in Washington's current confrontation with Havana and raises broader questions about the continued use of legal, economic, military pressure against governments in Latin America that refuses alignment with geopolitical interests of the United States. Now, according to multiple reports, the same Miami-based legal team involved in Raul Castro's case is also handling the prosecution of former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, reinforcing concerns across the region about the expanding use of U.S. lawfare and extraordinary territorial power against adversarial states. And notably, this escalation comes just over a decade after Raul Castro stood beside former President Barack Obama during the historic reopening of relations between Cuba and the United States. That diplomatic opening raised hopes that decades of hostilities, sanctions, covert operations, and isolation policies might finally be put to bed, and a framework based on coexistence and mutual respect for the sovereignty and dignity of the Cuban people can be respected. In a few seconds, I'll be joined by James Early, the former Director of Cultural Heritage Policy at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. For the last 50 years, James Early has been traveling to Cuba to meet with the people, academic experts, government officials, as a Cuba solidarity activist with a keen eye on the progress of Afro-Cubans. In January 2026, James met with Cuban President Díaz-Canel and Foreign Minister Fernández de Cosio. Very good to have you with us, James.
Good to be back with you.
James, let's begin with the indictment against the former President Raúl Castro. What is this about, and who are the Brothers to the Rescue?
Well, this is an attempt in a propagandistic way to rationalize a framework for intervention, to say that the leadership has got to step down in terms of some pressure agreement that the CIA through Marco Rubio and President Trump are trying to extract from Cuba. I mean, here's a 94, 95-year-old former president who is not about to submit himself to an indictment from the United States. But it does set up an additional rationale to really undermine the leadership of Cuba. This goes back to the Eisenhower administration in '61, which first broke relations and stopped sending oil and stopped importing sugar, which was about 60% of Cuba's export at that time. And with a document from the State Department that can be found online that basically says these people like their revolution, the fact that they now control their country, and they're very infatuated with this leader, Fidel Castro, and they're not going to be pried away from him. So that economic pressure must be put on them in order then to put pressure on the government. I like to frame it to put pressure on the daughters and sons that they have elected to be their government. They do have elections. They may not be the same kinds of elections that they do in Britain. Are the elections in Britain the kind of elections that we do in the United States? But democracy, in terms of the ordinary citizen, the demos, is expressed, and people can have and should have critical reflections about that. So that this attempt is really to further undermine the government and to move it away from the citizenry. It's important to note that between 2015 and 2017, the administrations of President Barack Obama and President Raul Castro actually brought the United States government in from the cold, from being a renegade. When you look at it in the context of the United Nations, always overwhelming vote to remove this embargo, this congressional embargo, which is an economic warfare tied into restricting the government's ability to provide welfare in terms of food and fuel and medicine for its citizens, and therefore really mutating, cutting, undermining the citizen's ability to really express her or his full educational background, one of the most educated populations in the world, according to the UN. So this is the broader context of this threat. There is documentation that can easily be found online from the US State Department that there were warnings from the National Security Council in 1962, months ahead, saying to the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, stop these illegal flights out of Miami, going into Cuban airspace, dropping leaflets over Cuba. Because eventually, if you don't, the Cubans are likely to shoot down one of the planes. This is documentation from the US State Department. And it also shows the problems within the US governance system that the National Security Council could not leverage the Air administration to stop these illegal flights. It's been documented that these flights, their manifestos were illegally written. They were false, rather, not illegal. They were false written. They said they were flying someplace else. But I also have documentation with the late Sal Landau, who did the first international interview with Fidel Castro, where the two of them are, Fidel Castro is then retired, where they are going into detail about the back and forth, as Sal Landau was one of the interlocutors with members of the US government and with the Cuban government in that. So this is the context of this setting up a further rationale for what I think we should expect is a likely invasive measure against Cuba. We should not the general public should be concerned about that, as are the Cubans.
James, a little bit more background about these flights. Can you detail in terms of who were they? Were they the U.S. military, or was it?
No, these are Cuban Americans. One trained, self-identified, self-articulated as having been trained, quote unquote, as a terrorist, his words, Jose Basulto, Basaulto. I think he's now deceased. There were a number of attacks on Cuba. There was a shoot down of the plane of 73 passengers some years earlier, the bombing in Cuban hotels. So these people were involved in Miami, these Cuban Americans tied into the national security setup of the United States, specifically the CIA. They were the product of an earlier attempt through the Bay of Pigs in '62, if I recall correctly, trying to overthrow the Cuban government. And so the US government was well aware and never took measures to stop this or to indict any of these people who were self-admitted terrorists because they were tied into the CIA. Brothers of the Rescue, they were called. And we must also recall that after the Cuban intelligence system began to document these terrorist activities in Miami, they sent a full dossier to the United States detailing in future years these terrorist organizations. Well, what the United States government did was look at it and say, my goodness, they know more about what's going on than we know about what's going on here. They must have somebody here. And out of that emerged the discovery of the Cuban Five intelligence officers who admitted that they had been sent here to the US because the US would not stop these violations of international law and these terrorist attacks, and that they were here to document and to provide further evidence to the United States government to take initiative to stop these illegal activities, which the U.S. government did not. In turn, they put these people, tried them, put them in prison. The leader of it, I think, for 2 life terms. And he served like 15, 16 years in prison before they were released.
And where are the Cuban Five now?
The Cuban Five are back in Cuba. One of them heads the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. Another heads the International Friendship Association. They went back to their ordinary lives. The leader of the group, Gerardo Hernandez, was an engineer. I've talked to people in Cuba, everyday citizens, who said, one day he just didn't come to work and we never saw him again. And of course, he had gone underground and coming into the US. Um, there were many efforts inside the US, many really humanistic efforts on the part of some US Congress people at the petition of his wife, who was not admitted to the United States to see him while he was imprisoned, saying that she was in her fertile years as a young woman and would not be able to produce a child with her husband because he had 2 life terms. And a U.S. congressional member and his wife arranged for semen to be taken to Cuba, where she was impregnated, and they have the famous daughter Emma, who must be now 8, 9, 10 something years old, whom I've seen before. So there are many efforts on the part of United States citizens, joining citizens around the world for basically, I would say, humanitarian purposes. Some of them are progressive or are revolutionaries or socialists. But the majority of the people who are saying this is not the way to carry on international affairs through the starvation of an entire nation, that this is affecting all Cubans, no matter what they think about their own government. None of them can get access to transportation, and oil. Trash is piling up all over the place with airborne diseases because they don't have fuel to send in trash trucks. They ironically produced, 5 vaccines during COVID, used all over the world in places, including in developed countries like Italy, Brazil, Mexico, China. But they had difficulty getting needles because of the United sanctions on companies that produce the kinds of materials that they use. They have one of the most noted biotechnological systems in the entire world. This small country of 11 million people, less now because 2 million have left in the last about 3.5 years, economically pushed out. In a world of 8 billion people, they're able to produce this. And so the United States is really a rogue government, both morally and then the violation of international law. And many citizens recognize that and would want to protect the national sovereignty of Cuba to let Cubans resolve their own affairs. I would refer people to President Barack Obama's statement back around 2016. You can find it online. And it says explicitly, we don't support regime change. The Cuban people will determine their own internal development, as all nations do. So this is, again, a broader context with this recent sort of propaganda attack on former President Raul Castro, which is symbolic. It's almost unimaginable that they would invade Cuba to kill a 94, 95-year-old ex-president. And certainly he is not going to submit himself for extradition.
And that's a very important point you're making. This is symbolic. Is it symbolic given the threats that are underway from the Trump administration?
Well, it's symbolic in the context of the propaganda war. So there are many elements of this attack on Cuba. There is the architecture of economic strangulation, preventing them from getting fuel, which is a blockade. It is objectively a blockade, certainly from the vantage point of the Cubans, but by anyone looking at it, literally, it blocks countries from delivering needed resources. On the side of the U.S. Population, it is an embargo that really informs this blockade. And an embargo is a congressional sanctioned mechanism to attack the Cuban economy with the intent of the Cuban population rebelling against their sons and daughters, again, who they have elected to be their stewards of governance. So it has it's a part of the psychological warfare as well. The United States government is trying to remove Díaz-Canel, the president of Cuba, who was the assistant to Raul Castro for 10 years before he was nominated and approved by the National Assembly as president of the country. I think he is perhaps in his seventh year or so of what Raul Castro orchestrated through the legislature, that no leader can serve more than 2 5-year terms. That's their democratic framework, and then you cannot come back into the for to be elected as president of the country. So it is symbolic, but it has a material effect on the emotions, on the anxiety with the blackouts and the pileup of trash and the airborne diseases and the like. It further infuriates the public and further moves the public to demand more of their stewards of governance, as all citizens should, no matter what the threats externally might be. If one puts oneself in a position to be a representative of civil society at the governance level, then you have to deal with the hands that you're dealt. And so, citizen, this is a part of a kind of symbolic propagandistic attack on the emotions of the Cuban population.
La razón por la que se ven obligados a sobrevivir 22 horas al día sin electricidad no se debe a un bloqueo petrolero por parte de Estados Unidos. Como ustedes saben mejor que nadie, llevan años sufriendo de apagones. La verdadera razón por la que no tienen electricidad, combustible ni alimentos es porque quienes controlan su país han saqueado miles de millones de dólares.
James, I would really like for you to address the specificity of Marco Rubio's role in these discussions and what he has at stake in terms of his role in the conversation that's going on, the negotiations that's happening, and his, I guess, a very aggressive position on Cuba.
Well, Marco Rubio is vying to become the president of the United States after his boss, Donald Trump, in prior elections referred to him as the diminutive little Marco. Talked very badly about his wife, as he did with all of the candidates. He's an opportunist, a outright opportunist who is willing to, on the one hand, say that the Cubans are his people. He was born here in the United States. He was not born in Cuba. His parents left him, as I recall, actually before the revolution. Even if they did not leave before the revolution, he is carrying out that vendetta of people who want to go back and take over Cuba. In effect, they're saying that we are the ones who should lead Cuba, not the Cubans in Cuba. Even if the Communist Party of Cuba were to disappear and the government of Cuba, which is not the same as the Communist Party, were to disappear, they're not saying the Cubans in Cuba should determine their stewardship. They're saying that they are the ones who should go back. And of course, they were funded by the CIA when they came into the United States of America. They all thought they would be back in 2 or 3 months. So they left all of their industries, and the Cuban government was able to take over the modes of production and really begin to dramatically work with citizens to change society. Marco Rubio, I think, is the point person of framing the overall strategy, probably in relationship to the Heritage Foundations and others. It's not Donald Trump, he doesn't think strategically. He's impetuous. You never know what he will do. But Marco Rubio is really representing a right-wing base of Cuban Americans in South Florida, Miami in particular. But South Florida is also the home of the Latin American and Caribbean right wing and the drug mafia and all of that. It's almost a jurisdiction unto itself under the borderline of the U.S. and the flag of the U.S., but very much culturally a part of the Caribbean and Latin America. And many of the right wing, including Bolsonaro in Brazil, which is a part of an international right-wing authoritarian organization. Urban was just voted out, but he's a part of the right-wing mainstream movements in Germany and France. This authoritarianism is organized internationally. And so Rubio, in many ways, has matured to become the front person for that. And he certainly is around Cuba as he talks about his parents and his heritage, but he is willing and as actively economically strangling Cubans. This is the inhumanity. This is the immorality. But he's also vying to be president of the United States, and he's vying to become a part of the global right wing. Recently, in Germany, where he called out for the recolonization of the global South. He said that the civilizing mission of Europe was interrupted by these anti-colonial liberation movements and godless communism, and that what has to be resurrected is the centrality of, quote unquote, we the Europeans, we the Christians. He's moving with the right wing fundamentalists, where the State Department has really become more theocratic in its messaging. Even mainstream pundits are recognizing this shift to the right and the emergence of Marco Rubio as a politician at the highest levels of statecraft and positioning himself on the global stage. So he is the one who is orchestrating this against Venezuela. Trump, you never know what Trump will do because he is impetuous and he is a megalomaniac, a narcissist who wakes up and wants to bomb somebody. But Rubio is a more strategic-oriented person. One of the things that I think we have to watch with regard to Rubio is now that he has got Trump attacking Cuba, Trump is unpredictable. So he may not be on the same page. He and Rubio may not be on the same page. And my guess is Rubio may not be happy with some of the statements of Donald Trump vis-a-vis Cuba. On the one hand, he's going to send a battleship 100 yards away from Cuba. And on the other hand, he says, we want to talk and we want to help Cuba. They've turned truth on its head. So it is really difficult to get a full measure. But I think it is clear enough with Rubio that he is an emerging factor for the presidency of the United States up against Vance. And he's really burnishing his bona fides now in the international arena in a way that Vance will not be able to claim that. Or perhaps any other right-wing candidate, if indeed there is an election for the next president of the United States, because it's not altogether clear. Trump has talked about, quote unquote, remaining as a dictator, his terms, not mine.
James, Ada Farah, who is the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who wrote Cuba and American History, recently published a letter to the president of Cuba, Diaz-Canel, in the New York Times, articulating that she's flatly against a U.S. invasion of Cuba, but that Cubans are ready for changes, opening up of Cuba, and particularly the young people eager for these changes. What are your thoughts on that letter?
Well, interestingly enough, I would say her position correlates with the position of the president of Cuba, who has said there are objective reasons people are frustrating, that they're protesting, that they're demanding change. That is to be expected. What is unacceptable from the vantage point of the Cuban government is to use that to overthrow the governance and economic system of the nation. So that Ferrer's argument is really an objective one. When people can't get access to basic necessities, they should not sit silent. And people who have put themselves forth to be stewards of government must face the cards that they are dealt. And it is not enough just to say it's the U.S. embargo. So even Diaz-Canel says that. I was one of 3 people in January in a delegation of 20 from the U.S. Who met with him and the Deputy Foreign Minister Cosio. I've had an opportunity to meet with President Canel over the last 10 years on a number of occasions from the time that he was vice president, when Danny Glover, the citizen artist in the United States, and I met with him for almost 3 hours 10 years ago to talk about issues of race and racial discrimination throughout the hemisphere, in which when he arrived in his presidency, he then sets up a presidential commission, quote unquote, against racism and discrimination. Not because Danny Glover and I talked to him, because we were reflecting the expressions and the self-organization of Afro-Cuban and other citizens in Cuba on racial discrimination, which was both a legacy of disenfranchisement and outright racism prior to the revolution, but which is reproduced in the revolution by its own reports in households about people's physical features and with remittances. You know, the people who left the country were, quote unquote, significantly or largely white. And so without intended sense of superiority, when they send resources home, they get color-coded as just objectively so. So Ferrer's point is something, again, I think really coincides with something that the president of the country has said, that yes, people are frustrated and they are demonstrating that and they're clamoring for change. What I think the Cubans have not done as good a job as they might, and people in the solidarity arena like myself have done a poor job of looking at what have been the democratic developments within the Cuban Revolution over the last 67 years. So we have a revolution that comes into play that is immediately threatened by the world's greatest economic and military power. So you have a really stringent approach on the part of government to concentrate decision making more directly within governance. But over the course of although they set up the Federation of Cuban Women, the young communists, the young people's expression, they really were very poor in dealing with the issue of race. They had this sort of post racial perspective that we are all just Cubans and we are all the same. But then they began to recognize that there was a legacy question about race of who inherited what and who. And then there was an ongoing reproduction, a contemporary reproduction. And they have taken democratic initiatives by recognizing the self-organization of Afro-Cubans outside of parastatals of government who begin to protest and to demand the family code over the last number of years, in which LGBTQ rights are one of the most dramatic developments on the entire planet, in which the president went around the country asking people to support that because the Catholic Church, for a number of reasons, understanding in the context of Catholicism, were against these LGBT rights. These literally thousands of meetings over 3 or 4 years of report after report of citizens reading and criticizing and making recommendations on the policy projections. And then out of that comes a synthesis. Now, a country of 11 million people, at that level of scale, you can do that. It's almost unimaginable in a country of 300 and some odd million people like the United States that you could have that kind of intimate democratic exchange, if you will. But I don't think a good job has been done in really educating the world about the internal dynamics, the debates that go on in Cuba. The debates about Eurocentrism, people said, oh, that was about race. I said, no, that was explicitly about why did the government think that they could set down a European model in a mixed race society in which the majority of people are worshiping these African religions, where Catholicism was never really a strong factor as it was in Mexico, or it still is, or Brazil, or Argentina, some of these places. So this is, again, a context of saying to the listening audience, we should take whatever individual view we want to take ideologically, politically about Cuban socialism, but we should be honest and earnest and see how they debate and find compromise internally, because they actually do that. And like every nation, it has its own contradictions in the context of its virtues and its achievements. And what is being called for, even in the United States Congress today by a number of Congress people, is to recognize and support Cuban sovereignty and its right to be self-determined. Congressman Jonathan Jackson out of Chicago, the son of Jesse Jackson, and Congresswoman Jayapal were in Cuba 3 or 4 weeks ago. People should go online and read their statements about the horrendous situation they saw in hospitals and on the street, and talking to Cuban citizens, not just to the Cuban government. And their call with many others. They're including a number of Republicans who have historically wanted to trade with Cuba. Cuba would rather trade with the United States out of a simple arithmetic. It's 90 miles away from the United States, and it's probably a few hundred miles away from the Mississippi River, where they can import rice and chicken wings and so forth and so on, rather than trying to deal with Vietnam or Brazil, which is added cost. And so that the Cubans have always wanted to have that kind of economic relationship, but to determine through their own citizenry and their own stewards of governance, how they would handle their economy and their society, and not let others impose. And let me just transition on this point. Because little Cuba stood up against the giant of the United States and did it their way, they're being punished, as Haiti is still being punished for defeating Napoleon and the French, and the way that it's just been economically raped over the years by the Western countries, particularly with France and the United States, and to some degree Canada involved in that. And the failure of Brazil, when it, through a UN mandate, sent troops into Cuba to actually handle that in an effective way of dealing with democracy on the ground. So these are the complexities of governments and their compromise under threat from the United States.
Let's talk about the material effects of the sanctions that have been in place really for a very long time. Tell us about the history of the sanctions and the effects it's having on the ordinary people.
Well, starting with President Eisenhower, the U.S. sanctioned Cuba and stopped sending oil, stopped buying its major export product, which was sugar. 60% of that was coming to the U.S. market. So already it is reducing the ability of governance to provide for the well-being of its diverse population across the nation. Then the Kennedy administration took additional sanctions and moved them towards what we now know to be the embargo. Over years and years, this was updated, including right up through the Biden administration, which only at the very last minute, like 2 weeks or so before the Biden administration was through, did it remove Cuba from the terrorist list. Now, this is the Democratic Party centrist Biden administration, who Vice President under Barack Obama, who departed radically, dramatically away from the 2015 to 2017 normalization of relations established by the administrations of President Barack Obama and the presidential administration of Raul Castro. Again, people should go online and look at how all of the cabinet posts, interior, agriculture, all kinds of cabinets with the United States, it's outlined what kind of relationship they would have with Cuba to reach mutual interest and to continue in respectful civic ways about their differences. As the Cubans have said always, we will talk to you about anything with no preconditions, and it must be a respectful dialogue. The United States did not follow up on many of those agreements that they had done with Cuba, including 20,000 people a year being able to migrate out of Cuba towards the United States, as the United States has these kinds of migratory agreements with nations all across the world. And so the attempt has all along been to undermine the Cuban government by putting pressure on their citizens. But it is very important. I was just looking at it again this morning, that Barack Obama, he signs this document. He says explicitly, we do not support regime change. That it is a matter for the Cuban people to decide their governance and their project. And that they wanted to assist the economic reforms of the Cuban government, which would be in the interest of the United States, as explicitly said, but also in the interest of the economic stability and viability within Cuba.
James, critics of President Barack Obama, he made several advancements and openings, but they also argue that he didn't do enough to stabilize that relationship.
I would totally agree with that. I mean, I think we want to judge our stewards of government by their policies, not by their skin color, not by being the first or whatever other sort of sociological dimensions that we tend to use here in the United States. That, oh, you're a woman, or you're Black, or you're gay, and therefore this somehow is to translate into policy. No, those things don't translate into policy. They certainly contextualize and assist policy. And Barack Obama, in my view, did not do enough, and he has disappeared from the scene on the Cuba question. This is arguably his highest international affairs accord with President Raúl Castro on the normalization of relations, and by way of evaluation of how other nations around the world, the great majority of the nations of the world, have repeatedly, annually at the UN, called for the dismantling of this embargo, to enter into the accords post-World War II that have been accumulated since 1947, and the ways in which governments should handle mutual interest and differences, deep ideological and political and economic differences. Accords have been set up within the UN, in which the United States has been a rogue government. The United States and Israel consistently vote against this, but as they are violating all of the post-World War II accords, as well as dismantling, as they have openly said, the dismantling of the administrative state in the United States of America, read the dismantling of liberal democracy. So this is the context in which, again, the rogue development of the, not just Donald Trump as an individual, the Heritage Foundation, a third of the voting population of Make America Great Again, the MAGA citizenry, and other entities that for many decades have been studying how to restrict democracy here in the United States and how to revive the Monroe Doctrine. Donald Trump just said a few days ago, this is quote unquote our hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody in it that does not agree with our approach to the hemisphere, it will be considered an enemy. And so acts of, objectively, we have acts of war, as we saw in Venezuela. Even some centrist Democrats, while they did not like Maduro, President Maduro, they were against this kind of international, a violation of international law. So this is a situation that we are facing, and again, the demand has got to be on our governance system to change its ways with Cuba.
James, is there a progressive caucus within the United States, both, I should say, Congress and Senate, in terms of a more positive approach to Cuba? And is there any way to leverage that in this current moment?
There is a caucus called the Progressive Caucus, which is quite amorphous. It goes in many ways, and so it is not as coherent and certainly not as consistent as one would like it. There are individuals who have stepped forward, like Jai Paul, who I think is still chairing the Congressional Caucus, or it's chair from the last year, Congressman Jonathan Jackson. But there is no evidence of a consistent caucus, a consistent discussion.
Now, Cuba has had an annual resolution at the UN General Assembly for 30 years now, calling on the international community to support them in calling for an end to the financial embargo, commercial and economic activity in Cuba. And this has been overwhelmingly supported by the international community, but the UN General Assembly lacks the binding authority to enforce this, and the U.S. continues to ignore it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a simple matter that the United States is an imperial power. Even some of the mainstream pundits, even some of the elected congressional officials will now use that term. It's an imperial power that might makes right. We're seeing the highest, most profound expression of the dismissal of laws that have been accumulated both inside the nation and again in the post-World War II accords, notwithstanding many limitations and problems within the United Nations, it's still in its articulation as the highest achievement of humanity at the nation state level of how to live in a globalized world with some stability, with some predictability. And so what we're seeing is the violation of all of that. And we're in a very unpredictable moment, and it's an imperial moment. And we find that the architecture of democracy in the United States is paralyzed. The foreign affairs, I was just reading a statement by Congressman Gregory Meeks, who is a minority foreign affairs chair, who gratuitously puts out that Raul Castro should be tried for murder of Americans. And then the following statement are very, I would say, progressive policies of dismantling the embargo, removing the fuel blockade, building a more direct relationship with Cuba in its attempt to change its own internal economic stability. So this is the why. The United States government, in its arrogance and its dismissal of international law, and while it's sharply and deeply expressed in the sort of the megalomania and of a Donald Trump, it runs broader than this individual. It's in the very structure of U.S. governance, as we see with the case of Palestine, in which only recently have we gotten a break within the Senate where people, to some degree, while they will not acknowledge the genocide, they stand up in limiting U.S. complicity in that, which has been a bipartisan affair of sending material aid for what most of the world now sees clearly as a genocide of killing children, women, starving them. And the same now is going on in Cuba. So, Cuba is one of the leading biotechnology countries in the world, ironically. This a small country of, again, less than 11 million people in a world of 1 billion people emerges through a will of governance. One of the highest educated populations in the world, according to the United Nations. The Cubans don't have to really spout this themselves, whose children score off the charts in math and science and great literary figures and musical figures, one of the four major ballets of the world, and so forth and so on. Why is the United States doing this? It's out of an imperial arrogance. It is a signal to, not just a signal, it's a message to the rest of the world. Do not defy the United States of America. And of course, now with globalization, the rise of China, China being the major trade partner throughout Latin America, the United States is trying to now restrict the relationship of the countries in Latin America, the Americas, and Canada, and with threats even to Canada, of colonization of Canada's quote unquote the 51st Amendment, Greenland. And while I laugh at that, we really can't laugh at this administration because it is an unpredictable administration. And so one must prepare for the worst, as we saw with the violation of national sovereignty in Venezuela.
James, let's also talk about how other Latin American nations are responding to the current pressure on Cuba and potential threats of invasion. Now, Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico and Lula da Silva, Brazilian president, have all come out against any aggression towards Cuba, calling for diplomatic conversations and resolution. And the Canadian company, Sherritt International, who has done some very good work in Cuba, under these conditions has actually withdrawn and paused their activity in Cuba. Now, there are movements in Latin America, plus the certain countries with strong leadership and economic power that could actually assist, yet they are restrained. Why is that?
That's a really important question. I think Sheinbaum has really been a shining star in many ways. And while she has provided aid as some other countries, her articulation of the context of that, the right of a sovereign nation to develop relations with other sovereign nations, I think she has been more consistent in her framework and in her articulation to both her public and to the general publics and to governments around the country, around the hemisphere. In the case of Brazil, which has a very strong economic capitalist class, in a country that's self-identified as 53% negro y raza mixta. So the race question is really the contextual, horizontal, democratic question, not a kind of minority affairs question. President Lula, whom I've spent time with, I think is very restricted vis-a-vis the opposition forces, particularly the economic forces in his nation. So he has a different kind of balance that he has to try to achieve in compared to Sheinbaum, who's got an overwhelming mandate in Mexico, are in contrast to Canada. Sheriff, the Canadian company that has worked with Cuba for many decades on nickel and cobalt, which are the two basic minerals. Cuba does not. Cuba has some oil, but it's a heavy oil. They've made a lot of progress in the last few months on some kind of heating process to refine that oil that they've not been able to do before. But all of these countries are ultimately compromised under the imperial threat of the United States government, which first carries on an economic warfare against them in terms of sanctions, which penalizes the American population in terms of higher prices, which fuels the pockets of the U.S. oil companies. The U.S. is the biggest oil producer in the world. No, people think that that comes out of the Middle East with OPEC, not so incidentally, of which Venezuela was one of the founding members of OPEC years ago. So it is the imperial might and the threat of the United States that we have seen people do just the unimaginable, where Cuba has provided a surplus of medical personnel, particularly doctors, that go all around the world in a voluntary service in which they pay their tax to the government to be able to support free education, to be able to support free healthcare, who are now being called slaves by Rubio at the State Department and others, and putting a lot of pressure on these underdeveloped and developing countries, these mid-level countries, to expel medical personnel, which, unlike their doctors concentrated in the large metropolitan areas in these countries throughout the world, including in South Africa, the Cuban doctors go into the smallest, most challenging spaces within these nations. I've visited them in Venezuela. I've seen them in South Africa and in Brazil. Jamaica has broken their deal, and citizens are up in arms about this because they're not receiving a basic human rights of healthcare from their governments, but the relationship with Cuba was able to provide that. So it is the military might, it is the economic might of the U.S. that compromises internal democracy, even in some of the larger economies of our hemisphere, particularly Brazil, Mexico, and then throughout the Caribbean.
James, there has been quite a bit of civil society activity in the United States resisting U.S. policy towards Cuba, more aligned with what you described earlier in terms of what Barack Obama wanted to do in Cuba. And yet we don't hear those voices anymore under the Trump administration. Why is that? And what activities are taking place to resist this kind of potential invasion, the blockade, the various sanctions that are in place on Cuba?
Well, over the last 67 years, there have literally been thousands of people-to-people relations of university students, musical groups, plastic arts groups, humanitarian aid groups, Code Pink, Pastors for Peace, carrying tons and tons of supplies to Cuba, violating U.S. laws to do so, and in some instances. Code Pink continues under legal framework to every other month or so, they're carrying tons of rice into various locations in Cuba. There are people who carry hard devices and things of that sort. So there's a lot of people-to-people activity, and that is to be applauded. It's also coming from all around the world. The limitations of that is that a government cannot build its well-being policy for the complexities of its nation just on voluntary associations and not knowing when things will be coming. Governments have to set forth calendars, and this is where the blockade and this not being able to do regular business, to not having access to the financial architecture of the world, because the United States then penalizes even developed nations, Germany, France, Canada, for working with Cuba has almost no access to global banks because they're threatened by the United States government. So these activities are going on and they're to be applauded. However, for the listening audience, whether it's an audience in the United States or wherever on the globe, the electoral battlefront, organized, mobilized citizens saying to their stewards of governance, here are the policies that we demand of you. That is where we have to put increased pressure, because this is then what allows for the opening of a stable diplomatic bilateral relationship between two countries, whereas voluntary movements and humanitarian movements and street organized protests, all of which are very important, they don't have the consistent engagement in the policy arena. It's just the nature of the democratic architecture. So we must speak to our elected officials and demand that they represent our interest in being, full participants in the family of nations. Again, that is not saying that one has to support Cuban socialism. I might support Cuban socialism, but someone else has a right to have a different perspective. But what we should not have a right to have a difference over is the recognition, again, of these accumulated accords over many decades, where countries say, this is how we handle mutual interests, this is how we handle differences among us in peaceful and civil ways, in which the United States is in violation, both from a moral point of view, but most importantly, from a legal international point of view. The United States government is violating all of those policies. And again, Barack Obama, where is he? We need him to speak up on this policy agreement that he was at the center of with President Raúl Castro, and his voice is nowhere to be heard in this process. He's about to open up his library on Juneteenth in Chicago, so perhaps he's preoccupied with that.
James, this has been a very insightful and deep conversation, and I want to come back to you as things are unfolding in Cuba. And I thank you so much for joining us today and giving us this incredible historical and as well as the current situation with Cuba. Thank you so much.
Thank you.